Before Canada was ever stitched together by a flag or a constitution, it was a collection of contested lands, divided loyalties, and broken promises. A battleground between empires, cultures, and dreams. From the icy rivers of Quebec to the bustling taverns of Toronto, from Indigenous council fires to British war rooms. This is the forgotten story of how a colony fractured by rebellion, foreign rule, and fierce debate slowly carved its path toward unity. And how in 1867, Canada was born, not from a revolution, but from relentless negotiation, deep compromise, and the dreams of men who dared to imagine a country. By the close of the 18th century, the British Empire had lost the 13 colonies, and tens of thousands of United Empire loyalists, still loyal to the Crown, were flooding north. Many settled in the rugged backwoods of present-day Ontario, while others joined established French-speaking communities in Quebec. To handle the growing tensions between the newly arrived English Protestants and the long-established French Catholics, Britain passed the Constitutional Act of 1791. This law split the colony into two new provinces. Upper Canada, governed under British common law, where Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe would lay the foundation of English Canada, literally carving out York in 1793, a muddy outpost that would one day become Toronto. And Lower Canada, where French civil law and Catholic institutions remained protected, anchored by cities like Montreal and Quebec City. In theory, both provinces had elected legislative assemblies, but in practice, real power remained firmly in the hands of appointed British governors. As Governor Guy Carleton, later Lord Dorchester, resettled loyalists and tried to manage French-English relations, it became clear. These two Canadas were not just divided by law, but by language, religion, and worldview. Long before Europeans drew lines on maps, the land now called Canada was home to hundreds of Indigenous nations, sovereign, organized, and thriving. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, Britain reinforced the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which promised that Indigenous lands could only be ceded through negotiated treaties. But promises often gave way to pressure, and colonists were pushing westward. As British agents like William B. Robinson traveled north into the Great Lakes region, they secured major treaties with the Ojibwe, notably the Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior Treaties of 1850, covering vast swaths of land in northern Ontario. Further west, in the Red River region, the Métis, led by families like the Riels, were already blending Indigenous and French cultures, resisting encroachment on their territory. Out on the Pacific coast, Governor James Douglas, operating out of Fort Victoria, struck a series of controversial agreements, the Douglas Treaties, with Coast Salish and Nucha-Nulth peoples. But many of these agreements were poorly explained, hastily translated, or simply ignored later on. And then there was Tecumseh, the brilliant Shawnee leader. During the War of 1812, he allied with the British to defend Indigenous homelands, fighting as far south as Fort Meigs and as close as the Thames River in Ontario, where he died in 1813. His dream of an Indigenous Confederacy died with him. The treaties signed during this period would shape Canada's future, but for many Indigenous nations, they marked the beginning of displacement, poverty, and a fight that still continues today. By the 1830s, frustration boiled over. The people of both Upper and Lower Canada had had enough. They were tired of taxation without representation, tired of British-appointed elites making all the decisions. In Lower Canada, the Chateau clique, a small, wealthy Anglophone class, controlled politics and commerce, sidelining the French-speaking majority. The resistance was led by a fiery lawyer named Louis-Joseph Papineau, head of the Parti Patriote. At a rally in Saint-Denis, he called for responsible government and protection of French language rights. When the British refused to budge, Papineau's supporters took up arms. Clashes broke out across the Richelieu Valley, at Saint-Denis, Saint-Charles, and finally, Saint-Eustache, where British troops burned rebel positions to the ground in 1837. Meanwhile, in Upper Canada, radical journalist William Lyon Mackenzie, a thorn in the side of British authorities, gathered his own rebel forces in Montgomery's Tavern, on the outskirts of Toronto. He hoped to launch a surprise attack on the city, but the plan failed. The rebellion was crushed in days. Both uprisings were poorly organized and quickly defeated, but they sent a powerful message. The people of Canada wanted change. Shaken by the uprisings, Britain sent a nobleman named Lord Durham to investigate the cause of the unrest. What he found was damning. In his 1839 report, Durham famously described Lower Canada as being gripped by two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. He called for the unification of the Canadas and the implementation of responsible government, where the executive would be accountable to the elected assembly, not the governor. But instead of embracing full democracy, Britain only took part of his advice. In 1841, the Act of Union merged Upper and Lower Canada into one, the Province of Canada, with a single legislature. Canada West, formerly Upper Canada, and Canada East, formerly Lower Canada, now had to share power. But they were still bitterly divided by language, religion, and history. The capital shifted from Kingston to Montreal, then back to Toronto, and finally to Ottawa, chosen in 1857 by Queen Victoria herself as a compromise between English and French Canada. But tensions lingered. Real reform was still out of reach. After years of protest and political wrangling, change finally came in 1848. Two unlikely allies, Robert Baldwin, a quiet lawyer from Toronto, and Louis-Hippolyte Lafontaine, a French-Canadian orator from Boucherville, formed a cross-cultural alliance. Together, they pushed for responsible government not as rivals, but as partners. When they won a majority, Governor-General Lord Elgin, despite fierce opposition from Tory elites, allowed them to form a government and run the colony. For the first time in Canadian history, colonial leaders, not British appointees, held the reins of power. But progress came at a cost. When Elgin signed the Rebellion Losses Bill to compensate victims of the 1837 uprising, angry mobs in Montreal rioted and burned the Parliament building to the ground. Still, the principle had been established. Canada now had something approaching real democracy. The 1850s brought prosperity and paralysis. Railways stitched the colonies together, with the Grand Trunk Railway linking Montreal and Toronto. Timber, wheat, and fur flowed to Europe. The Reciprocity Treaty of 1854 with the United States created a boom in trade. But politically, the province of Canada was stuck. Both Canada West and East had equal seats in the Assembly, even though English Canada had far more people. No one could win a stable majority. Government after government collapsed. Between 1854 and 1864, there were 6 different administrations. The colony was stuck in what historians now call the Great Ministry Crisis. A new solution was needed, something that could break the deadlock and bring the colonies together. It was in this chaos that 3 men began to plot a new path. George Brown, the reform leader and publisher of The Globe in Toronto; George Etienne Cartier, a French-Canadian nationalist from Montreal; and John A. Macdonald, a sharp-tongued lawyer from Kingston, with a vision of unity. In 1864, leaders from the Maritimes gathered in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, to discuss a possible union of the Atlantic colonies. But when the Canadians crashed the party, they proposed something much bigger: a united federation. That September, politicians from Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick walked the streets of Charlottetown, drank together in taverns, and debated in candle-lit halls. They agreed in principle, and by October, they met again at the Quebec Conference, drafting the 72 resolutions, the blueprint for a new country. Over the next 2 years, those ideas were refined in the London Conference, where the Fathers of Confederation met with British officials to finalize the plan. And on July 1, 1867, the British North America Act was signed into law. Canada became a dominion within the British Empire. John A. Macdonald became the first Prime Minister, and the new nation began with 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. A new country had emerged, not through revolution, but through negotiation, resilience, and relentless compromise. From divided colonies to a unified dominion, the story of Canada is not one of conquest, but of coexistence. Of battles fought not just on fields, but in parliaments, in courtrooms, and around tables where languages, loyalties, and identities clashed. This is the story of how Canada became Canada.